The high desert sun, a merciless coin of hammered brass, burned in a sky so pale it seemed bleached of memory. Silence lay heavy over the canyon, a thick, dusty blanket smothering the usual buzz of insects and call of birds. It was the silence of absence, of life violently erased. Sheriff Silas Morgan stood at the edge of the ruin, his boots coated in fine, gray ash. The scene before him was a still life of tragedy, the skeletal ribs of wagon frames picked black against the red earth, a scattered trail of personal treasures, a shattered china doll, a water-stained book, a single man's leather boot, telling silent stories of lives interrupted. His posse of 4 men moved through the wreckage with a grim, quiet efficiency, their faces hard. They had been too late. The smell of old smoke and something sweetly foul hung in the air. Silas's own face, beneath the wide brim of his hat, was a landscape of weathered cliffs and guarded canyons, his eyes the color of a winter river. He had seen such scenes before, though never did the sight lose its power to hollow a man out. It echoed the private ruin within his own chest, the one he carried every day back to his big, empty house on the edge of Bitterroot Springs. "Nothin' alive, Silas," called Tom Bledsoe, his deputy, kicking at a charred crate. "Buzzards got to 'em days ago." Silas gave a slow, heavy nod, the weight of his badge feeling like a leaden star on his vest. He turned, his gaze sweeping the canyon walls, the scattered boulders, the scrubby brush. His job was over. Now it was just a matter of noting the details for a report that would likely never find its way to any grieving family. He took a step back toward his horse, the finality of death a familiar companion. Then, the wind shifted. A low, moaning gust snaked through the canyon, rattling dry leaves. And within it, so faint he thought he'd imagined it, came another sound. Not a bird, not an animal. A human sound. A broken, airless whimper. He froze, holding up a fist. The men behind him stilled. The sound came again, from a tumble of massive, sun-warmed rocks at the canyon's northern edge. It was the sound of pure, trapped terror. Silas moved, not with haste, but with a deliberate, powerful grace, his hand resting on the worn grip of his revolver. He approached the rocks, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Hello," he called, his voice rough from disuse and dust. "Anyone there?" Only the whisper of the wind answered. He peered into a dark, narrow crack between 2 monoliths. At first, he saw nothing. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw the shape of a dress, faded calico, torn and stained. He crouched down, the hard stone biting into his knees. She was curled into the smallest ball possible, wedged into the stone womb as if trying to become part of it. A woman. Her face was buried in her arms, but he could see a cascade of matted, dark hair, and the violent trembling of her slender shoulders. "Miss," he said, his voice dropping to a tone he hadn't used in years, one meant to soothe spooked horses and frightened children. "You're safe now. The men who did this are gone." Slowly, painfully, she uncurled. Her face, when she lifted it, was a mask of dust and dried tears, etched with lines of utter exhaustion. But her eyes, they were the startling green of new aspen leaves, wide and lost and deeply, profoundly empty. They looked at him, through him, seeing not a rescuer, but another unknown shape in a world that had become a nightmare. She blinked, and a clean trail cut through the grime on her cheek. She tried to speak. Her lips, cracked and dry, moved, but only a ragged breath came out. She looked down at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger, then back at him, that terrifying emptiness filling her expression. "Can you tell me your name?" Silas asked, carefully extending a hand, palm up, into the shadowed space. She stared at his hand, then her gaze drifted past him to the smoldering wreckage. A fresh wave of trembling seized her. She wrapped her arms around herself and shook her head, a small, desperate motion. Not a refusal, but a confession. She didn't know. The realization settled over Silas, colder than the mountain shadow that was beginning to stretch across the canyon floor. He was not just looking at a survivor, he was looking at a blank page, a soul scrubbed clean by horror. The lawman in him knew the right thing was to take her to Widow May's boarding house in town. But the man in him, the one who returned every night to a house that echoed with the ghosts of a family lost to fever, saw the profound loneliness mirrored in her green eyes. He couldn't leave her. The thought was simple, stark, and undeniable. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "All right." He shrugged out of his heavy duster, the leather warm from the sun. Moving with infinite care, he reached into the crevice and draped it around her shaking shoulders. She flinched at the contact, then seemed to sink into the offered warmth, her fingers clutching the coarse material. He didn't try to carry her. Instead, he just offered his hand again, a steady bridge from the dark rock into the light. After a long moment, she placed her cold, trembling fingers in his. Her touch was as light as a bird's wing. He helped her stand, her legs buckling. She leaned into him, not as a woman leans into a man, but as a sapling leans into a post, for sheer support. The posse gathered, their hats in their hands, a solemn honor guard for this one fragile life pulled from the ashes. The ride back to Bitterroot Springs was slow and silent. She sat before him on his horse, enveloped in his too large coat, her back rigid, never relaxing against his chest. Silas kept his arms around her to steady her, feeling the frantic beat of her heart through the layers of leather and cloth. He spoke no comforting lies, made no promises he couldn't keep. The only sound was the steady plod of hooves on the hard trail and the sigh of the wind. Doc Henderson confirmed it in his clean, herb-scented office. Physically, she was dehydrated, bruised, and scraped, but whole. Mentally, the door was locked and the key thrown away. "The mind can do that, Silas," the old doctor said, wiping his spectacles. "When what's outside is too terrible to let in, it walls itself off. The memories might come back in drops, or in a flood, or never." Night had fallen by the time he led her up the path to his farmhouse. It stood 2 stories tall, solid and dark against the starry sky. He hadn't lit a lamp in the upstairs window for another person in over 5 years. He ushered her inside, the door groaning on its hinges. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of pine soap and loneliness. A fine layer of dust danced in the beam of his lantern. "This is my place," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. "You can stay here. There's a room." He led her up the stairs, each step a loud protest in the quiet. The spare room was simple, a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, a window looking out over the moonlit fields. He set the lantern on the washstand. "Try to rest." She stood in the center of the room, still wrapped in his coat, staring at the bed as if it were another foreign and frightening object. He hesitated at the door, then pulled it closed, leaving it open just a crack. He retreated to his own room across the hall, the one that still felt too large, and sat on the edge of his own bed, listening to the profound silence. It was a silence that lasted perhaps an hour. Then, it was broken. A sound seeped through the crack in the door, a muffled, choked sob, quickly bitten off, as if she were trying to swallow her own fear. Then another. And another. They were the raw, ragged sounds of a soul completely adrift. Silas sat still, his fists clenched on his knees. He was a man of action, of barked orders and hard justice. Comfort was a language he had forgotten. Yet, the sounds pulled him to his feet, drew him across the dark hall. He pushed the door open gently. She was sitting bolt upright in the bed, the covers pulled to her chin, her eyes wide and glistening with tears in the sliver of moonlight from the window. She was looking straight ahead, seeing not the wall, but whatever horrors her mind had recreated in the dark. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the side of the bed and sat on the rough wooden chair beside it. For a long time, he just sat there, a solid, silent presence in the gloom. Then, slowly, he reached out and rested his large, calloused hand over hers where it clutched the blanket. Her skin was ice-cold. At his touch, she gasped, her eyes flying to his face. For a second, he thought she would pull away. But then, her fingers unfurled from the blanket and turned, gripping his hand with a strength that surprised him. She held on as if he were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. She didn't speak, didn't thank him. She just held on, her breath gradually slowing from frantic hitches to deep, shuddering draws. He stayed there, his hand in hers, as the moon traced its path across the floor. He stayed until her grip finally relaxed in sleep, until her head sank back against the pillow, the tracks of her tears silver on her cheeks. Only then, with great care, did he ease his hand free. He pulled the blanket up over her shoulders and stood, his joints stiff. Looking down at her in the quiet dark, Silas Morgan felt the first, faint crack in the wall around his own heart. He had rescued her from the rocks, but in the simple, desperate clasp of her hand, she had, without knowing it, begun a rescue of her own. The dawn that crept into the spare bedroom of Silas Morgan's farmhouse was timid, painting the walls in shades of gray and pale gold. Liana awoke not with a start, but with a slow, confused surfacing, as if rising through deep, murky water. For a blessed moment, there was only the unfamiliar texture of rough linen sheets and the pattern of light on a ceiling she did not know. Then, the void within her rushed in, a silent, yawning chasm where her past should have been. The fear returned, cold and tight in her chest. But it was edged now with a new, sharp memory, the feeling of a large, warm hand enveloping hers in the dark, a steadfast anchor in the terror. Downstairs, the scrape of a chair and the clang of an iron stove door echoed through the quiet house. Silas was moving, beginning his day with the grim, practiced routine of a man long accustomed to solitude. Liana lay still, listening. The sounds were not threatening, they were simply there, solid and real in the emptiness of her mind. She pushed back the blanket and swung her feet to the floor, the pine planks cool and grainy beneath her bare skin. The dress she had been found in, now clean but sadly mended by Widow May's swift hands, lay folded on the chair. She put it on, the fabric feeling both foreign and familiar, a costume for a person she did not know. She found him in the kitchen, his broad back to her as he scooped coffee grounds into a pot. The room was large and serviceable, but it held a stark, unlived-in quality. A fine layer of dust clung to the shelves, and the windows were smudged, softening the view of the sprawling fields and distant mountains. Silas turned, and she saw a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or a mild alarm, cross his stony features before it was banked back down into his usual guarded neutrality. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There's coffee." She nodded, unable to find words. She watched his hands, the way he moved with a spare, efficient grace. He filled 2 chipped enamel mugs and pushed one across the heavy table toward her. She wrapped her hands around it, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. The silence between them was not empty, but thick, filled with all the things she could not remember and all the things he would not say. That first day set the pattern for the ones that followed. Silas would leave for the sheriff's office in town, his hat pulled low, a man encased in duty and solitude. Liana was left in the vast, echoing silence of the house. At first, she simply wandered, a ghost in another ghost's home. She traced a finger along the mantelpiece, leaving a clean line in the dust. She peered into empty rooms that smelled of disuse. She stood for long minutes at the window, watching the wind stir the tall grass, searching the landscape for a flicker of recognition that never came. But her hands, it seemed, remembered what her mind did not. On the second afternoon, driven by a restless need to do, she found a rag and a bucket. She began in the parlor, wiping away years of neglect from the surfaces. The dust was a tangible enemy, one she could see and defeat. With each swipe of the cloth, the rich grain of the oak table emerged, the deep red of the brick hearth revealed itself. The work was physical, simple, and profoundly satisfying. She attacked the kitchen next, scouring the stove until it gleamed, washing the windows until the world outside snapped into brilliant, sharp focus. When Silas returned that evening, he stopped on the threshold, his hand still on the door latch. He took in the clean room, the smell of soap and vinegar hanging in the air, the fire crackling brightly in a hearth that had known only cold ash for years. His gaze traveled to Liana, who stood by the table, nervously wiping her hands on her apron, another item unearthed from a forgotten trunk. "You didn't have to," he said, but the words lacked force. He stepped inside, the usual heaviness of his entrance somehow lighter. "I wanted to," she replied, and it was the truth. It was the first want she could clearly name. The next day, she explored the overgrown garden plot behind the house. Tangled weeds choked the earth, but beneath them, she found the stubborn spears of rosemary and thyme, the woody skeletons of last year's tomato plants. With a determination that felt like a memory, she began to clear, her hands digging into the cool, dark soil. The physicality of it grounded her. Here was a thing she could nurture, a thing that could grow. In town with May, she traded some of her careful cleaning of the boarding house for seed packets, zinnias, carrots, green beans. Life, she decided, would take root here again. Silas watched this transformation from a distance, a silent, brooding spectator to the reclamation of his own world. He came home one afternoon to find her on a step stool, straining to reach the top shelf of the pantry. Without a word, he crossed the room, his presence suddenly filling the space behind her. He reached up, easily retrieving the jar of molasses she sought. As he handed it down to her, their fingers brushed. A simple, accidental touch, but it sent a current through the dusty air of the kitchen, a live wire of awareness. She looked up, her green eyes wide and close, and he looked down, his Winter River gaze holding hers for a heartbeat too long before he stepped back, the moment broken but not forgotten. The weather turned warm, a true spring heat. He found her one afternoon struggling with the woodpile, attempting to split logs for the stove with a hatchet that was too heavy for her. "You'll hurt yourself," he said, coming out onto the porch. He took the tool from her, his hand completely covering hers on the smooth wooden handle. He didn't let go immediately. He stood behind her, his body a warm wall at her back, and guided her through the motion. "It's in the shoulders, not the arms," he murmured, his voice a vibration so close to her ear. "Let the weight of the head do the work." His chest was against her back, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. The lesson was about wood, but the tension that crackled between them was about something else entirely. She could feel the hard strength of him, the leashed power in his arms as he guided her hands. The log split with a loud crack, falling into two neat pieces. In the sudden quiet that followed, neither moved. The world narrowed to the point where his skin met hers, to the rapid, shared rhythm of their breathing. Slowly, he turned her around, the hatchet forgotten at their feet. His eyes searched her face, asking a silent, urgent question. Her answer was in the slight parting of her lips, the way she leaned into the circle of his arms. He bent his head, and their first kiss was not a gentle meeting, but a collision of sealed loneliness finally breaking open. It was heat and desperate inquiry, the taste of coffee and sun-warmed skin. His hands came up to cradle her face, his touch calloused and infinitely tender. Her own hands fisted in the rough fabric of his shirt, holding on as the solid earth seemed to tilt beneath her. It was a kiss that spoke of empty houses and empty memories, and a fierce, sudden need to fill them both. When they finally parted, breathless, they simply stood, foreheads resting together, in the dappled sunlight of the yard. No words were needed. The dam had been breached. That evening, after a supper eaten in a new, charged silence, another soul found his way to their doorstep. Silas, going out to check on the horses, caught a furtive movement by the old apple tree. A boy, maybe 15, with hungry eyes and a livid scar curling from his brow to his cheek, was stuffing half-rotten windfalls into his shirt. The boy froze, a deer in lantern light, poised to bolt. Law said to question him, to be wary. But Silas, looking into those desperate eyes, saw another kind of wreckage, another life scattered. He thought of the clean, warm house behind him, of the woman inside who had known terror and was making a sanctuary. He looked back at the boy. "You'll get a bellyache from those," Silas said, his voice steady and low. "Come on inside. There's stew." The boy, Jack, hesitated, every muscle taut. Then, from the doorway, Liana appeared, backlit by the lamplight from the warm kitchen. She didn't speak, just offered a small, understanding smile. It was that smile, perhaps, that did it. Jack's shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a profound weariness. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, crossing the threshold from the cold dark into the circle of light and warmth that Silas and Liana, without ever planning to, had begun to build. The family, born of rescue, had just found another piece of itself. The boy, Jack, became a silent third heartbeat in the house by the fields. He was like a skittish colt, all sharp angles and watchful eyes, flinching at sudden movements. Liana approached him not with force, but with a quiet persistence that mirrored the way she tended her new seedlings. She mended the torn sleeve of his threadbare shirt without asking, leaving the garment folded neatly on his straw tick in the small room off the kitchen that had once been a pantry. She placed an extra biscuit on his plate at supper, a simple, unspoken offering. Silas, for his part, gave the boy space and purpose. He showed him how to properly curry the horses, how to mend a fence post, speaking in short, direct sentences that demanded no emotional reply. The work was a language Jack understood, a trade of labor for safety. The house itself seemed to breathe easier, to expand with this new presence. The warmth Liana had kindled in the hearth now spread to fill the rooms, thawing the perpetual chill from the corners. Evenings found them in the parlor, a scene of unlikely domesticity. Silas would clean his revolver or read a week's-old newspaper, Liana would hum softly as she sewed, and Jack would whittle a piece of kindling with a knife Silas had lent him, his intense focus a shield against the past. It was a fragile piece, but it was peace nonetheless, woven from shared silence and the unspoken agreement that here, within these walls, they were safe. This growing sense of sanctuary created a new, potent space between Silas and Liana. The desperate hunger of their first kiss settled into a deeper, more focused current. A glance across the supper table would hold a second too long, laden with unspoken promise. When his hand would brush hers passing a dish, the simple contact now sizzled, a tiny spark in the quiet room. The tension was a living thing, humming just beneath the surface of their daily routines, sweet and unbearable. The summer sun soon beat down on Bitterroot Springs with a fierce, dry intensity. One afternoon, when the heat made the very air in the house feel thick and woolen, Silas saddled the horses. "There's a place," he said to Liana, his tone leaving no room for refusal. "A creek-fed pool up in the Box Canyon. Cools the blood." Jack, with a wisdom beyond his years, muttered something about checking the fishing lines and disappeared toward the stream behind the barn. The ride was short but steep, into a cleft in the rust-colored rocks where cottonwoods grew thick and whispering. The canyon walls rose high, casting deep, cool shadows, and at its heart lay a pool of startling blue-green water, fed by a trickling waterfall. It was a hidden world, dappled with light and echoing with the sound of water. Silas dismounted, his movements easy. "No one comes here," he said, a simple statement that felt like a gift. He began to unbutton his shirt, not with ceremony, but with a straightforwardness that stole Liana's breath. She turned away, her fingers suddenly clumsy on the buttons of her own dress. The act of undressing here, in the open air with him, was terrifying and exhilarating. She heard the soft splash as he entered the water. Steeling herself, she slipped out of her chemise and drawers, leaving them in a pool of faded fabric on a sun-warmed rock. The air kissed her bare skin, raising goosebumps. She kept her back to the pool, to him, as she walked to the water's edge and waded in. The cold was a shock, then a blessing, enveloping her up to her shoulders. When she turned, he was there, waist-deep, the water beating on the dark hair of his chest. Sunlight fractured on the surface, painting his skin with shifting coins of gold. They did not speak. He moved toward her, the water rippling around him. He reached for her, his hands finding her waist beneath the surface, the cool liquid doing nothing to dampen the heat of his touch. His skin was smooth and solid under her palms as she rested them on his shoulders. They were close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, the tiny scar above his brow, the way his gaze dropped to her mouth. He bent his head, and this kiss was not like the first. It was slower, deeper, a deliberate tasting. The cool water lapped around them, a stark contrast to the fire igniting in their veins. His hand slid from her waist up the sensitive curve of her spine, pulling her flush against him. The feeling of his bare chest against her breasts, separated only by the slick water, drew a soft, involuntary gasp from her throat. The sound seemed to unleash something in him. His kisses trailed from her mouth to her jaw, then down the column of her throat, his tongue tracing the frantic pulse there. Her head fell back, her eyes closing against the brilliant blue sky. Her hands tangled in his wet hair, holding him to her. He walked her backward, gently, until her shoulders met the smooth, mossy canyon wall. The stone was cool and rough against her skin. He braced one arm beside her head, caging her in, his body a furnace even in the water. His other hand began a slow, exploratory journey. It cupped the full weight of her breast, his thumb circling a peak that tightened instantly into a hard, aching bud under his touch. She cried out, a short, sharp sound lost in the waterfall's whisper. He bent his head, his mouth replacing his hand, the hot, wet suction pulling a thread of pure, white pleasure straight to her core. Her knees buckled, but he held her up, his strength absolute. His explorations grew bolder, more intimate. His hand slid down over the flat plane of her stomach, through the soft thatch of hair, and found the slick, hidden heat between her legs. She shuddered violently, a sob catching in her throat. He stroked her, his fingers learning her folds, finding a rhythm against a small, exquisite nub that made her see stars behind her closed eyelids. The world narrowed to the cool stone, the hot water, and the exquisite torture of his touch. She was climbing a peak she had never known existed, her breath coming in ragged pants, his name a broken chant on her lips. Just as she was about to shatter, he stopped. He withdrew his hand, his own breathing harsh. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes dark with a need that mirrored her own. "Not here," he murmured, his voice rough as gravel. "Not for the first time. Not against a rock." The denial was a physical pain, but in his eyes, she saw not rejection, but a fierce, protective reverence. He wanted more than a frantic joining in the water. He wanted a bed, and darkness, and time. He helped her, trembling, back to the shallows, where they dressed in a silence thick with unsated desire. The ride home was a blur of sensation, every jostle of the saddle a reminder of the ache he had awakened and left humming within her. That night, the house felt different. The air seemed charged, every creak of a floorboard a whispered promise. Jack had taken his plate to the porch, granting them a privacy he perhaps sensed they needed. They ate little, the silence between them now a taut wire. After, as she washed the dishes, he came up behind her, his body not touching hers, but the heat of him seeping through her clothes. He took the damp cloth from her hand and placed it on the sideboard. Then, he turned her to face him. There were no more words. He took her hand and led her from the kitchen, through the parlor, and up the dark stairs. Not to her small spare room, but to the door of his own chamber at the end of the hall. He pushed it open. The room was large, dominated by a heavy bed of dark oak. A single lamp burned low on the dresser. This time, there was no hesitation, no playful discovery. This was a claiming, and a surrender. Clothes were not so much removed as shed, a frantic scattering of fabric on the floor. The lamplight played over the hard planes of his body, the broad shoulders, the scarred chest, the powerful thighs. She drank in the sight of him, fully aroused, and felt no fear, only a deep, pulling hunger. He laid her back on the cool, sun-bleached sheets, and followed her down, his weight a delicious anchor. His mouth and hands were everywhere, reigniting every nerve he had discovered in the water, and finding new ones. He worshipped her breasts, laved her navel, trailed kisses down her inner thighs, until she was writhing, begging, her fingers clutching at the sheets. When his tongue finally found her most intimate core, she arched off the bed with a sharp cry, the pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. He held her there, at the precipice, until she was sobbing his name, her entire body taut as a bowstring. Only then did he rise over her, his eyes locking with hers. He pressed forward, slowly, inch by devastating inch, filling the aching emptiness within her. There was a brief, sharp pinch, a fleeting memory of a different kind of pain, and then he was fully sheathed, and they were one. He went utterly still, letting her adjust, his face a mask of strained control. She wrapped her legs around his hips, drawing him deeper, and that was all the invitation he needed. He began to move, a slow, deep rhythm that quickly built into something more urgent, more primal. The bed frame groaned in time with their joining. She met him thrust for thrust, each one stoking the fire higher, coiling the tension tighter. Her world dissolved into sensation, the slide of skin on skin, the scent of him mixed with her own arousal, the guttural sounds torn from his throat. The peak, when it broke over her, was a cataclysm. It ripped through her in wave after wave of blinding release, a silent scream on her lips as she convulsed around him. Her climax pulled him over the edge with her. He drove into her one final, deep time, his body shuddering, a low, broken groan escaping him as he spilled his seed deep within her. In the long, trembling aftermath, he did not pull away. He collapsed beside her, gathering her against his sweat-slicked chest, her head tucked under his chin. Their hearts hammered a frantic, slowing duet against each other. The quiet of the room returned, but it was a different quiet now, sated, profound, and thick with the scent of their loving. No memories had returned to Liana in that moment. Instead, something more important had happened. A new memory had been forged in the heat of their bodies, a foundational truth written into her very bones: she was his, and he was hers. And in that truth, for the first time since the rocks, she felt not like a survivor, but like a woman found. The weeks that followed the night in Silas's bed settled into a new and profound rhythm, like a deep, steady heartbeat at the center of the farmhouse. Liana was no longer a guest in a spare room, her hairbrush now lay beside his on the dresser, her few simple dresses hung next to his shirts in the wardrobe. Their nights were a private world of exploration and heat. They learned the map of each other's bodies in the dark, the spot behind his ear that made him shiver, the way she would gasp when he traced the sensitive skin of her inner thigh with his calloused fingertips. Their loving was sometimes slow and tender, a languid rediscovery that left them wrapped in each other, whispering half-formed dreams against sweat-damp skin. Other times, it was fast and hungry, a collision against a wall or on the kitchen table in the noonday quiet, driven by a raw need that would strike them both like lightning. In these moments, the world fell away, leaving only taste and touch and the desperate, perfect joining of two souls sealing their pact in the dark. This private union radiated outward, strengthening the fragile family they were building. Jack, seeing the unspoken bond between them, began to lose his hunted look. He smiled once, a brief, startling flash, when Liana presented him with a new shirt she had sewn. He called Silas sir with a respect that was no longer fearful, and he began to linger at the table after meals, listening to the quiet plans for the farm. The house was no longer a shelter against the past, but a promise for the future. Silas found himself thinking of planting an orchard, of building a proper room for Jack off the porch. The ghosts in the corners receded, replaced by the living, breathing reality of a woman's laughter and a boy's steady work. The peace was so complete, so enveloping, that the outside world's intrusion felt like a physical blow. It came on a dust-choked afternoon in the form of a stranger riding a tired horse. The man was a U.S. Marshal from another territory, his face lined from hard miles. Silas met him on the porch, his sheriff's instincts putting his body between the door and the visitor. The Marshal's news was delivered in a flat, professional tone. The gang responsible for the Wagon train raid had been cornered and captured in a shootout 3 territories over. One of them, a man named Coyle, was singing like a canary to save his neck. Said they'd been shadowing that train for days, the Marshal said, accepting a cup of water. Said there was a particular woman on it. Pretty, with dark hair and green eyes. He said she wasn't just a passenger. He claimed she was traveling to be a mail-order bride, promised to a shopkeeper in Silver Bend. Paid for and everything. The Marshal's eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked toward the window where Liana's shadow moved in the kitchen. Description matches your guest, Sheriff. The shopkeeper's name was Albright. Heard about the raid, figured she was dead. Might be interested to know otherwise. The words landed in Silas's gut like lumps of lead. Asterisk mail-order bride. Promise to another man. Asterisk the warmth of the house at his back felt suddenly like a lie. He saw the future he had just begun to allow himself to imagine, the orchard, the family, Liana in his bed every night, crumble into dust. The lawman in him knew the right course. He needed to verify the story, to meet this outlaw Coyle face to face, to see if the man's claim would spark any recognition in Liana, or if it was just the cruel lie of a desperate criminal. The man in him wanted to throw the Marshal off his land and bolt the doors forever. He had to go. There was no choice. He told Liana that evening after the Marshal had ridden on, his voice carefully stripped of emotion, laying out the facts like a courtroom report. He watched the color drain from her face, her hands clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles were white. The word bride seemed to hang in the air, a ghost from a life she couldn't remember, threatening to snatch her away. I don't remember any promise, she whispered, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror, not of the past, but of the future. I don't remember him. I know, Silas said, the words raw. But I have to know for certain. I have to look this Coyle in the eye. The night before his departure was charged with a desperate, aching energy. They put Jack to bed early, the boy sensing the storm in the adults and retreating to his room without a word. In the parlor, Silas checked his revolver, his movements precise and grim. Liana watched him, the distance of a few feet feeling like a canyon. The fear was a tangible thing, coiling in the room. It was the fear of his ride, of what he would learn, of the stranger named Albright who might have a legal paper claiming the woman Silas now knew, bone deep, was his. He finished with the gun and looked at her. The look was a fuse, igniting the tension that had been building all day. There were no gentle preliminaries. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her to him, his mouth crashing down on hers in a kiss that tasted of possession and panic. It was a kiss of branding, of trying to imprint himself upon her so thoroughly that no past could erase it. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her fingers digging into the hard muscles of his back, as if she could physically meld herself to him. They did not make it to the bedroom. He lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist, and carried her to the large, worn rug before the hearth. The firelight danced over their frantic movements as they tore at each other's clothes, buttons flying, fabric ripping. This was not the loving of discovery or comfort, this was a raw, primal assertion. When he entered her, it was with a single, deep thrust that drew a sharp cry from her throat, a sound of both pleasure and pain. He set a relentless, driving rhythm, each powerful surge a silent, furious vow, *, you are mine. You are mine, *. She met his ferocity with her own, her nails scoring his shoulders, her hips rising to meet every plunge. There were no soft words, only ragged breaths, grunts of effort, and the slick, urgent sound of their joining. It was a physical argument against fate, an attempt to outrun the truth with the sheer, blinding force of sensation. The climax, when it took them, was a violent, simultaneous rupture. She shattered with a choked sob, her body clenching around him in rhythmic waves, and he followed with a guttural roar, spilling into her as if he could seal his claim with his very essence. Afterward, they lay tangled on the rug, the fire warming their sweat-sheen skin. The desperation faded, leaving a hollow, tender ache. He brushed the hair from her damp forehead, his touch now gentle. "I will come back to you," he said, each word a solemn oath. "No matter what I find. I will come back." At first light, he stood by his horse, his saddlebags packed. He had given her his spare revolver, its weight unfamiliar and terrible in her hands. He had made her practice the action, his arms around her, his voice in her ear. "The safety is here. Point and squeeze. Don't pull. Promise me you'll use it if you have to. Promise me you'll lock the doors." She promised, the words like ash in her mouth. He cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, memorizing her. Then he turned, swung into the saddle, and rode out toward the main trail without looking back. To look back, he feared, would have unraveled his resolve completely. Liana stood in the yard until he was a speck, then a memory, on the horizon. The warm, living sanctuary of the house behind her felt suddenly like a beautiful, fragile target. She turned, walked inside, and turned the heavy iron key in the lock. The click echoed in the silence, the sound of a safe haven preparing for a siege. The silence after Silas left was a different creature than the one Liana had first encountered in the house. That earlier silence had been empty, waiting to be filled. This one was watchful, taut as a bowstring. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind in the eaves, felt like a held breath. She moved through the rooms, the weight of the revolver a cold, alien presence tucked into the apron pocket she had sewn for it. She followed Silas's instructions to the letter, doors locked, shutters fastened, the rifle loaded and propped by the front window. Jack, sensing the siege mentality, took to patrolling the perimeter with a quiet seriousness, his own borrowed shotgun cradled in his arms. The home that had felt like a living, breathing embrace now felt like a fortress under a calm but ominous sky. 3 days passed in this nerve-fraying limbo. Liana kept her hands busy, kneading bread until her shoulders ached, weeding the garden with a furious intensity, all while her mind raced down the dusty trail after Silas. Was he safe? What terrible truth was he learning? The marshal's words, mail-order bride, promised to another man echoed in her dreams, but they brought no face, no feeling, only a yawning sense of wrongness. Her heart, her body, every reclaimed memory of joy and warmth in this house, screamed that she belonged here, with Silas and Jack. But the law, and a piece of paper signed by a stranger, might disagree. On the fourth afternoon, a rider appeared on the long road leading to the farm. It was not Silas. This man sat his horse differently, with a slouch that spoke of easy arrogance, not weary travel. Liana, from the parlor window, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She sent Jack to the barn with a sharp, whispered order to stay out of sight, then took the revolver from her pocket and stood behind the heavy front door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The man dismounted at the porch step. He was handsome in a rough, worn way, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He knocked, a polite, steady rap. "Hello in the house," he called. "Name's Albright. I'm looking for a woman who might have been brought here after the Willow Creek raid. My fiancée." The name was a key, but it did not unlock a memory, it slammed into a wall of dread. Liana did not open the door. She spoke through the thick wood, forcing her voice steady. "There's no one here by that name." "See, that's curious," the man called Albright replied, his tone turning slick and persuasive. "Because I heard different from a fellow down in Mesa Verde. Said a woman matching her description was living with the sheriff. Dark hair, green eyes, can't remember much. Sounds an awful lot like my Lena." Lena, the name sparked nothing. No flicker of recognition, only a cold revulsion. "You're mistaken," she said, her grip tightening on the gun. "I've got a letter," he pressed, his voice hardening a fraction. "Signed by her. A contract. I paid good money for a wife, and I aim to collect what's mine. Now, be a sensible girl and open this door. We can talk civil about getting you back to where you belong." His words were wrong. All wrong. The way he said collect, the oily entitlement in what's mine. It scraped against every true feeling Silas had ever stirred in her, feelings of choice, of tenderness, of a love built, not bought. A sudden, piercing image flashed behind her eyes, not of this man's face, but of the smell of cheap tobacco and sweat, and the sound of that same voice, laced with violence, saying, "Don't look at them, just keep walking, or you'll end up like the rest." Asterisk. It wasn't a memory of love or promise. It was a memory of the raid itself. The voice from her nightmares belonged to the man on her porch. The realization washed over her like ice water, bringing with it a terrifying clarity. He was not a jilted groom. He was a predator. He had been among the outlaws. The mail-order bride story was a fiction, a cover to reclaim the one victim who had escaped, who could identify him. Her fear crystallized into a cold, sharp rage. "I know your voice," she said, her tone dropping, losing its tremor. "You were there. At the wagons." The silence from the other side of the door was profound, dangerous. The friendly pretense evaporated. "You think you remember something, girl?" he snarled, his fist pounding against the wood now. "You open this door, or I'll burn this pretty house down around you." She heard his boots on the porch boards, moving toward the window. It was now or never. As his shadow passed the parlor window, she did not point the gun. Instead, she acted on an instinct older than memory. She snatched the heavy cast-iron skillet from the hearth hook, and as the man's face, contorted with rage, appeared at the glass, she swung it with all her strength. The pane shattered in a spectacular cascade, the iron connecting with his shoulder with a sickening thud. He roared in pain and stumbled back. The door was no longer an option for him. She heard him cursing, fumbling at his hip. Jack, from the barn, had seen enough. A single, warning shot from the shotgun blasted into the air, the sound enormous in the quiet afternoon. Albright, or Coyle, or whatever his name was, flinched, turning his weapon toward the barn. In that moment of distraction, Liana raised Silas's revolver, shoved the barrel through the broken window, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, chewing splinters from the porch post, but it achieved its purpose. It bought time. The gunfire was a beacon. From the lane, a thunder of hooves answered. Silas, riding harder than hell itself, with Widow May and 2 townsmen following in a buckboard, crested the rise. He had returned a day early, a gut-deep terror having driven him to ride through the night. He took in the scene in an instant, the broken window, the stranger with a gun drawn on his home, Liana's pale face behind the revolver. "Drop it." Silas's voice was the crack of a whip, his own pistol already aimed and steady from the saddle. Albright swung around, but the fight had gone out of him. Faced with the sheriff's unwavering aim, the boy with the shotgun, and the armed man behind him, his defiance crumbled. His weapon clattered to the dirt. Silas was off his horse in a second, slamming the man against the wall of the house and disarming him with brutal efficiency. The truth came out in ragged, furious confessions under Silas's relentless glare. He was Coyle's younger brother. The real shopkeeper Albright existed, but his bride had died on the train. They'd used the story as a clever ruse to find and silence the only witness who'd seen their faces clearly. It was over. The threat was shackled, loaded into the buckboard, and taken away. The townsfolk drifted back to Bitterroot Springs with promises of gossip and admiration. May herded a shaking but proud Jack into the kitchen for a strong cup of tea. And finally, in the quiet yard littered with gunsmoke and broken glass, Silas and Liana were alone. He turned to her, his face etched with the exhaustion of his ride and the terror of what he'd almost lost. He saw the revolver still clutched in her white-knuckled hand, the determined set of her jaw, the fierce light of survival in her green eyes. She was not a lost waif anymore. She was a woman who had defended her home, her family, her truth. "You knew," he breathed, stepping closer, his hands coming up to frame her face. "You knew he was lying." "I didn't remember a promise," she said, her voice trembling now that the danger had passed. "But I remembered him. From the raid. My past, it began with him. It was always a prison." She looked up at him, tears finally spilling over. "You are my choice. This is my home. This is where my life begins." He pulled her into him then, a crushing embrace that spoke of relief, of awe, of a love that had been tested in fire and found unbreakable. That night, after the glass was swept away and the door made secure again, they climbed the stairs to their room. There was no desperate hunger this time, no fear of an ending. There was only a profound, slow-burning certainty. They made love in the moonlit room with a deep, reverent passion, a celebration of a future they had fought for and won. Every touch, every kiss, every shuddering peek was a seal upon their vow. She was not a mail-order bride, not a victim, not a lost soul. She was Liana Morgan, sheriff's wife, keeper of the sanctuary, mother to the family they had built from ashes and love. The town of Bitterroot Springs soon came to see the farmhouse on the edge of town not as a place of tragedy, but as a beacon. It became known as a place where lost things, people, animals, hopes, could find a gentle hand and a second chance. Silas's justice was tempered by mercy, Liana's garden overflowed with enough to share, and Jack grew tall and steady. Their love, born from rescue and forged in trust, was the unshakable foundation. It was a story whispered about how the hardest hearts could soften, how the deepest wounds could heal, and how the most unexpected love could build the strongest home of all. If you were swept away by the journey of Silas and Liana, if you felt the warmth of their sanctuary and the heat of their unwavering love, then you won't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe now to be the first to know when new tales of passion, courage, and heart-stopping romance unfold. Your next adventure in a world where love conquers all is just a click away.